For 2021, Ford is bringing us two brand new off-road vehicles that share the Bronco name, but don't really share too much other than the name. We have the all-new Bronco and then the Bronco Sport, which I'm talking about today. This is the smallest member of the Bronco family. It's really more closely related to the Ford Escape than the full-on Bronco, and this is the one that I am oddly enough more interested in because this is going to be a lot more affordable. The price range of the Bronco Sport is going to be almost entirely inside the price range of the Ford Escape. So if you can afford an Escape or a RAV4 or a CR-V, but you want something that's a little bit more rugged and a little bit more off-road capable, there's a Bronco for you. As you'd expect, the Bronco and Bronco Sport share a lot of styling cues. We have very similar looks up front, and the front grille does change based on the model that you're driving. This particular one is an Outer Banks model. The yellow one that you saw before is the new Badlands trim. The headlamp theme is very similar to the larger Bronco. We have available LED fog lights below, a very large Bronco logo right there in the middle, and then a discreetly hidden radar adaptive cruise control sensor in the middle. The main change for the Badlands trim are the inclusion of some recovery hooks integrated into the front bumper. They're two, one on each side. Mechanically, the Bronco Sport shares about 70 to 80% of components with the Ford Escape, but this is not simply an Escape with a boxier body job, because they've changed important things like the wheelbase. This actually has a 1.6-inch shorter wheelbase than the Ford Escape, and the overall length is considerably shorter as well. At 173 inches long, this is actually about the same length as a Jeep Compass rather than the Jeep Cherokee, and the wheelbase is considerably shorter as well, 3.6 inches. A nice touch with the Badlands model is that we have alloy wheels that look like steelies. These are actually not real steel wheels. These are, in fact, alloy wheels right there on each corner, but they definitely give this a distinctive look. The roofline has an interesting design touch that steps up towards the rear that reminds me a lot of Land Rover models. Not a bad thing to be reminded of when we're talking about a crossover that starts around $26,000. Ground clearance will vary based on the trim that you get. 7.8 inches is standard. If you get the Outer Banks model, like this one right here, that bumps up to 7.9, and if you get the Badlands with the optional tires, you get 8.8 inches of clearance. Water fording ability also varies based on the model. This particular one comes in at 17.7 inches. If you get the Badlands, that bumps up to 23.6. When the current generation Escape launched, a lot of folks were surprised that it had such a car-like look. It really does look like a crossover version of the Ford Fusion, rather than a mini truck like we see in the new RAV4. The Bronco Sport is the big reason for that, and of course the all-new Bronco, because Ford realized that customers have slightly different preferences. Some people may want something boxier and more truck-like, along the lines of the Bronco Sport and the Bronco, and some people may want that more sedan-like feel and look inside and outside. If that's you, then there's the Ford Escape. In pictures, the Bronco Sport can look a little bit larger than it really is, but standing right next to it, you'll notice that it definitely is shorter to the ground than the regular Bronco, and definitely not as wide either. In pictures, this looks like it's wider than an Escape, and the two vehicles are relatively similar in width. A lot of that has to do just with the way the rear styling is done, the large Bronco logo there, the fact that everything is very horizontal, including that release for the rear hatch. The tail lamps are partial LEDs, not full LEDs. And back here we have something that we see disappearing across a wide variety of vehicles. That's a separately opening rear glass. I wish every SUV or crossover had this feature because it makes it a lot easier to carry large items in the vehicle. Rather than having them hang out the hatch, you can have them just hang out the glass with the hatch closed. It also means that if you need to do a combination of carrying longer items, say a small kayak, this is a little bit of a tight dimension for some kayak designs, but you might be able to fit one in there, or perhaps skis or something like that. You can have other things in the cargo area and you wouldn't have to have them falling out or worry about them falling out. If you plan on doing some home improvement, this is also pretty practical. The best part about the rear glass in the Bronco is that it's also standard, it's not optional. So every Bronco Sport on the dealer lot will have that feature. Cargo capacity ranges between 29 and 32.5 cubic feet, depending on the version that you get, because right here under this load floor, we do have a full-size spare tire in the top-end trim. That's why that cargo figure changes a little bit. This is one of the only subcompact, really, or compact crossovers that has a full-size spare tire from the factory. In some alternatives, you could get one yourself and stuff it in the cargo area, but this is going to come right from the factory with a 225 width tire. Other Bronco Sport models will have a temporary spare tire under the load floor, and the load floor is a two-tiered design, so I can push it into a lower position that makes it about an inch below the opening lip. So definitely more room than we find in the Badlands version, but you could put a full-size spare tire in this model if you wanted to. It's just that the cargo area load floor wouldn't go in that lower position anymore. This Bronco Sport has no powered hatch, but we do have two large sturdy handles on either side to help you close the hatch. And then we have LED lights that are adjustable to help light the area behind the vehicle. Ford calls those floodlights. We'll have to wait and see how floodlighty they are once I can actually get my hands on one of these at home at night. Ford has made a big deal out of cargo practicality, so back here we have 4 carabiner-style cargo hooks, 2 on each side. Basically, you push your bag through there, and then the latch springs right back into place to keep that bag from falling out if you're going over some pretty big bumps. We have a 12-volt power port and a 120-volt power port, only 400 watts, though, on that 120-volt port. Under the hood, we find essentially the same engine lineup as the Ford Escape, minus the hybrid and plug-in hybrid options. Things start out with a 3-cylinder turbocharged engine. It's a 1.5-liter unit, producing 181 horsepower and 190 pound-feet of torque. That's the engine in this red model right next to me. Then there's an optional 2-liter turbo. You'll find that in the Badlands trim standard. That gives you 250 horsepower and 277 pound-feet of torque. That's pretty similar power output to the new Mazda CX-30, although the mission of this is very different than that CX-30. Both engines are mated to a standard 8-speed automatic transmission and standard all-wheel drive. So one of the important things to keep in mind if you're cross-shopping this with the Escape is that one of the reasons this is a little bit more expensive than a base Escape is that this has all-wheel drive standard and the Escape does not. So if you really want front-wheel drive in your next Ford crossover, take a look at the Escape. If you want all-wheel drive, that's going to be standard on this model. And they're going to be 2 different all-wheel drive systems. As you'd logically expect, the standard all-wheel drive system is very similar to the one that we find in the Ford Escape, although the software is specific to the Bronco Sport, because this has a bit more of an off-road mission to it. If you get the top-end versions of the Bronco Sport, the more off-road oriented versions, then they replace the standard rear axle with a torque vectoring unit. It can send 100% of power destined to the rear wheels to a single wheel in the back. It's a twin-clutch unit that we've seen before. In addition to giving you effective torque vectoring ability, it can also act as a limited slip or locking differential in the rear. But one important differentiator between this and something along the lines of a Cherokee Trackhawk, which is theoretically not a direct competitor because it is a lot larger than this, is the fact that the Cherokee does have 2-speed transfer cases. Oddly enough, it actually has 2 of them. It has 1 in the rear and 1 in the front, but does give you an actual low ratio mode. This will only lock the transmission into first gear. Although the Bronco Sport is technically a subcompact vehicle, it's again largely based on the Escape, which has an enormous amount of interior room, definitely more room than we find in the RAV4. So a lot of that translates over here to the Bronco. We definitely have a lot of headroom thanks to this very boxy styling. So if you're a taller person and you really wish your next crossover had heaps of headroom, sitting in a very upright position, this seat is all the way off the ground practically. I still have about 4.5 inches of headroom left or so. Now this seat is not quite as adjustable as you find in some of those more expensive crossovers that you might want to cross shop this with, but again, keep in mind the price tag and the competition for this model. One thing that surprised me in the Badlands trim is that we do have a urethane steering wheel. That's definitely not my preference. Logically, the rear doors are a little bit smaller and don't open as wide as the Escapes, but hopping here in the back seat, there is an enormous amount of room. Again, headroom is really the big benefit to this boxy style, and of course that really drastic roofline bump that we see on the outside. Sitting back here in the rear, it's obvious that these are stadium style seats, so these are much higher off the ground than the front seats, but I still have a lot of headroom and a pretty decent view. Again, about 4 inches of headroom back here, about 3 inches of legroom left. Although you might be hard-pressed to fit an adult up front and a rear-facing child seat behind them, you could definitely put forward-facing child seats. Large adults would have absolutely no problem in here. Ton of really nice touches back here too. We have some zippered pouches in the rear seat backs for storage to help keep things from falling out. Hooks and loops back here to help you hang things or store things right there on the rear seat as well. The interior design is definitely different than the larger Bronco. Sitting in the back seat, you can really see the bump up that we get in the roof. There's sort of a structural member right there that joins one pillar to the other, but then behind that the ceiling bumps up again, so we have a lot of headroom for the back passengers, a lot of headroom for the front passengers as well. If you get the optional moonroof, then it's just in front of that bump between the pillars. Height adjustable shoulder belts, 2-way adjustable headrests, and pretty unique upholstery. This trim is the first edition, which is kind of a combination between the Badlands model and the Outer Banks trim. So we get the Outer Banks interior with the off-road capability of the Badlands. Rather unfortunately, these are all sold out currently. This interior is navy blue and charcoal combination. It's also a mixture of fabric inserts like the gray section right here, leather inserts like the face of the seat, and the imitation leather like other portions of the seat itself. These seats are moderately bolstered, so if you're looking for something a bit more aggressive for off-roading, you may want to take a look at something else, but larger folks shouldn't have any problem with these seats. These particular seats are heated in this model, but they're not ventilated even though they are perforated. Moving over to the doors, that two-tone theme continues. We have that blue armrest right there tying it in with the seat, but the rest of the door is charcoal. The upper section of the door is made from a soft touch material, and in this vehicle, the trim that we find on the doors doesn't quite match the exterior paint color, but in some versions of this it does. So for instance, if you were to take a look at a very orange Bronco Sport like that model right there, you would get orange trim inside. Large portions of the dashboard are soft touch material, so the section right over here on the passenger side is. We get hard plastics lower in the dash like you'd expect in an inexpensive vehicle. A very large bin-style glove compartment. You could very easily put some larger tablet computers in there. Over on the dashboard, we find a mixture of hard and soft touch material, so that soft touch material wraps around the driver's side. Then we have hard plastics right over here around the instrument cluster. We then have a touchscreen LCD infotainment system. This is not running the latest version of Ford Sync, which I think is a pity. So this is a little bit different than the one that we find in, for instance, the new F-150 or the Ford Mach-E. Below that, we have some physical controls of the infotainment system. This does still support Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. We have an area where you can store smartphones, other items like that. There's a grippy texture in there, so definitely a lot of room even for some of those larger smart devices. We then have the engine start-stop button there, controls for the dual zone automatic climate control, Qi wireless charging mat, USB inputs for the infotainment system, and then a rotary style shifter here. I'm not a big fan of rotary shifters unless there's some other reason for it, but we don't find any under area storage compartments. There's a little one on the side, a little flap right there, but no big storage compartment under the center console that could justify the use of this rotary shifter. Kind of wish we had a traditional one. We have additional controls for the all-wheel drive system back here, electric parking brake, auto brake hold as well. Going in for a closer look, this is a rotary dial for the drive modes. They call them GOAT modes here. The trail control button is for hill descent control and forward progress control. We have a four-wheel drive lock button right there that locks the center coupling essentially, rear axle lock right there, and a button to enable and disable the traction and stability control. Between the front seats, we have a padded armrest that matches the upholstery cover. Inside, we have some USB charge-only ports. It's pretty decently sized. And then if we go over here to the driver's side, we find a partial LCD instrument cluster. This is definitely bigger than I had expected to find in a vehicle in this category. It looks to be about 7 inches, and it reminds me a great deal of the cluster that we used to find in some Ford truck models. Definitely not a bad thing to be reminded of. We have some off-road screens. We have the intelligent four-wheel drive power distribution and off-road inclination screens there, and then a 3-spoke steering wheel. Rather unfortunately, due to the ongoing pandemic, my time in the Bronco Sport has been somewhat limited. So we're starting out here near Frazier Park, California. We'll be driving over to one of California's state vehicle recreation areas. We'll be doing a 28-mile off-road drive loop, and then we'll be basically coming back. So I haven't been able to test this really out on most paved road surfaces too much. I haven't been able to do 0 to 60 testing, sound measurements, or any of that sort of thing. So instead, let's do sort of a stream of consciousness on the way the Bronco Sport feels. Obviously, on a rougher road like this, the Bronco Sport has a moderately tuned suspension because this is designed more for off-road duty, so it's not going to be as firm as something like a Mazda CX-30. But it also struck me as surprising that it's not quite as soft as some versions of the Jeep Cherokee. Now again, the Bronco Sport and the Jeep Cherokee are slightly different flavored vehicles. When it comes to performance figures, you should expect the performance of the Bronco Sport to mirror the Escape very closely, because this is about the same curb weight as the Ford Escape. It's a little bit smaller, it's a little bit lighter depending on the options that you get, or it could actually be a little bit heavier, again depending on the options you're taking a look at on this versus that Escape. Just over 180 horsepower up to 250 horsepower doesn't sound like an enormous amount when we're talking about compact crossovers, because there are more powerful engine options available in that segment. But when we're talking about subcompact crossovers, this is actually a really healthy amount of power. And the base version of the Bronco Sport is likely going to be notably faster than something like the Honda HR-V or the Toyota CHR or the vast majority of the entry-level options in this segment. Keep in mind, of course, that the price tag is going to be about 25% higher, of course, than a lot of those base options. So something like the base CHR, the base HR-V, they're not really direct competitors to the Bronco Sport either, even if you're taking a look at the absolute base Bronco Sport model. Going out on a limb, I'd guess that the 60 to 0 stopping distance for this vehicle is probably going to be in the 125-foot range. We do have wider tires than our average, 235 width tires on this particular model, but they're a little bit more off-road focused than on-road focused, so that may have an impact on the stopping distance. Again, all that will have to wait until I can get my hands on one of these at home to give you a better idea of exactly what it's like to drive. Let's talk about drive modes. All versions of the Bronco Sport come standard with all-wheel drive, as I mentioned before. 5 drive modes are standard by default, and then if you get the Badlands version or the first edition, then we get 2 additional drive modes. The first one is slippery, that's pretty logical there. We also have a sport mode, also pretty logical, as well as the eco mode. Then we have sand, mud ruts, and rock crawling. 2 of the drive modes are exclusive just to the top-end versions. Obviously, it's those more aggressive drive modes of mud ruts and rock crawling. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to push the Bronco Sport too hard out on paved roads like this, but it does have a pretty decent, confident feel to it. Road noise seems to be a little bit greater than we find in a number of the competition, but I think that's mainly due to the tires and the tire size that we have on this model. This is a bit more of an all-terrain style tire. It also is wider than average, 235 width on this model, and if you take a look at the average subcompact crossover, 205 to 215 width tires are pretty standard down there, and not too many alternatives that you could be cross-shopping against this will even have 225 width tires. Ford has made a pretty big deal about the Bronco's off-road capability, including the Bronco Sport model that I'm driving today. And that's why they held this launch event out at a state vehicle recreation area in Southern California. Right now, I'm pretty near the Grapevine, if you're familiar with California's geography. The vehicle is in mud rut mode because that's what this area is really known for in the winter. Rather, unfortunately, there's not a lot of mud because it's very, very dry at the moment in California. But this is still going to be the most off-road capable entry in the subcompact crossover segment or SUV segment, whatever you want to call this. That's due largely to the axle that we have in the back and the software capabilities of this all-wheel drive system. Because except for the rear axle, the rest of this all-wheel drive system is very similar to the one that we find in the Ford Escape with very different software. And software can make a pretty huge difference because rather than simply cutting engine power or trying to limit engine torque like you find in most all-wheel drive systems in this segment, this is a bit more interested in trying to send power to the wheels that theoretically do have traction. So in, for instance, a Honda HR-V, you're going to have troubles in a lot of off-road rugged situations because the solution for the traction issue is just cutting power. And that's not what's needed in order to get you over situations where you might have one wheel up in the air or where you really do have very limited traction on just one axle. In that vein, the software that we find in the Bronco Sport appears to be very, very similar to the way the software is programmed in the Jeep Compass. But the Jeep Compass doesn't have the trick axle that we find in this model. The Jeep Cherokee all-wheel drive system is definitely unusual in its own right because it actually has a transfer case. It's one of the only transverse engine vehicles in the world with a true transfer case. Oddly enough, it has two. It has one on the front axle and one on the rear axle, and they engage simultaneously. The drive shaft that goes between the front axle and the rear axle spins at the rate that the transmission is outputting, and then it goes through that two-speed transfer case and the torque gets multiplied on the rear axle. That all happens inside the transmission case for the front axle. The lack of a low ratio mode means that this is going to have a little bit less control in really low speed maneuvers. It's not going to have that engine braking ability in really steep downhill situations or some of the climbing ability that you'd get in a Cherokee. But remember, the Cherokee is going to be a lot heavier, partially because of those two-speed transfer cases. Clearly, if you're a really serious off-roader and you just want the best system from Ford, you're going to want the one in the new Bronco. But on the other hand, if you're a novice or relatively inexperienced, you're just getting into off-roading, then the system that's in the Bronco Sport is probably going to be a little bit better suited because this takes a lot of the guesswork about what mode to be in, what to do with the levers and switches and buttons, etc. It takes all that guesswork out. You just tell the vehicle what kind of surface you're on, and the system sorts out the rest. A kind of unfortunate thing about the 8-speed is that because first gear is so very, very low, it actually is so low that in driving situations like I'm in right now, 10 miles an hour where I might want first gear, it actually is low enough that the car won't let me engage it. A lot of off-road purists will laugh at the Bronco Sport because it's a small vehicle with a transverse engine and a front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive system. But this has a really nice nimble feel to it. I love the size of the Bronco Sport. If you've been out on a lot of really rough and narrow trails out in some of these state vehicle recreation areas, you'll notice that it seems like they were designed for ATVs. Some of them probably were. And, well, a Wrangler might feel at home on these trails. Something like the old FJ Cruiser from Toyota certainly felt enormous. And a full-size pickup truck feels like you're trying to drive a semi through a tiny residential area. So the size of the Bronco really has a great feel to it. This kind of reminds me of a modern day 21st century Suzuki Jimmy, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you want to get your hands on a Bronco, these will be on dealer lots just about the time you're watching this video. And they're going to start within the price range again of the Ford Escape line at $26,660. That's a little bit more expensive than the base Escape, but remember the Bronco Sport has all-wheel drive standard. If you want the Big Bend trim, that'll be $28,160. The Outer Banks trim, which is again this red model right here, $32,160 starting. The Badlands Edition, which is the more off-road capable version, $32,660. And if you're lucky enough to get your hands on one of the first edition models, those will start at $38,160. About within the price range not only of the Ford Escape, but also the Jeep Cherokee, which is kind of sort of a competitor to this. But I think making the Bronco Sport smaller than the Cherokee was a really wise decision because again, on the outside, this is about the same size, and depending on exactly how you have it configured, very similarly priced to the Jeep Compass, not the Jeep Cherokee, and that avoids a lot of direct comparisons, where the two vehicles are going to be a little bit more closely matched because, of course, we have a 2-liter turbo available in the Cherokee. We have a 3.6-liter V6 as well. We have the true 2-speed transfer case, full locking functionality as well. Which of the two vehicles is going to be more capable off-road? You'll have to wait until I can get my hands on both of them at home in order to tell you, but without question, the Badlands is more capable than what we see in the Jeep Compass or the Jeep Renegade, the two more direct competitors to the Bronco Sport. The Renegade also has this boxy, chunky look to it. It's smaller than this. The Compass is about the same size, but it's trying to channel its inner Jeep Grand Cherokee. Bottom line, if I were shopping in this segment right now, unquestionably the Bronco Sport would be at the top of my shopping list. I love the look, I love the interior, I really like the fact that Ford has gone out of their way to make the interior more premium than they ever really have before in a vehicle in this category. This absolutely blows the Ford EcoSport out of the water. If you're shopping for an EcoSport right now, just forget about the EcoSport, get one of these instead, unless you really, really need something less expensive. Some of the materials used on the inside, especially the seats, remind me an awful lot of the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Definitely a good thing to be reminded of in an inexpensive subcompact crossover. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you get if you're shopping in this segment? Would you get something like this? Would you get something like the bestseller in this segment currently, and that is the Subaru Crosstrek, or the Jeep Compass, which is the second bestseller for 2020? Or would you get something like the Bronco Sport, which I have to think is probably going to be in one of the top 3 to top 4 slots in terms of the sales charts as soon as Ford can get the production volume up. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. Find me over at Instagram, Facebook, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.